You now have access to one of the little known secrets of opening theory, and that is 1e4, knight c6, otherwise known as Nimzovich's defence. Now it doesn't sound like much, does it? And in fact the modern master wrinkles up his nose when he sees this move. But in the late 1980s, Tony Miles took up Nimzovich's defence, and his results since then have been nothing short of phenomenal. He wins game after game against masters and grandmasters alike. So that must mean that the opening has considerable practical advantages. Now if you put up a Rilo Pairs, a Sicilian, a French, a Caracan up against the average club player, he's going to know what to do. He's going to be ready to bash out his theory. But put up one knight c6, and most players are going to be thrown on their own resources immediately. And that is the major practical advantage of one knight c6. So come with me now, and let's investigate this combative and aggressive riposte to 1e4. I think you'll be surprised with what you're going to see. The introductory position for Nimzovich's defence starts with 1e4, knight c6. And I'm going to divide the video into three separate sections. In the first section, we'll see white playing the move 2d4, the most direct challenge to black's idea. Now I think Nimzovich's defence has got a bad reputation over the past few years because it was assumed that after 2d4, black should reply 2d5, which can lead to some very dangerous situations for black if he doesn't know what he's doing, and he certainly has to concede the initiative to white. For instance, after 3 knight c3, which is an excellent move. So I'm not going to be as cooperative as that, recommending the move 2e5 for black, a favourite of Grandmaster Tony Miles. In fact, you'll see from the Miles game contained on this video that black has achieved excellent results with this move. In the second section, we'll see white playing 2 knight f3. Now this is a rather hopeful move by white. I think many whites play this because they simply don't know the theory on Nimzovich's defence, and they're hoping that black is going to play 2e5. Well again, we're certainly not going to be as cooperative as that, going back into lots of main lines, and I'm going to recommend the move 2d6, whereupon our main lines will continue 3d4, knight f6, knight c3, and then the key move, bishop g4, which can lead to a very murky situation. This is very interesting chess, and we'll look at this a little later on. The final section ties up loose ends, and I'll be dealing briefly with rare white second moves, such as for instance knight c3, bishop c4, maybe even the crazy bishop b5, moves like 2f4 and 2d3. Vague moves which prove that white doesn't really know the theory, he's just trying to play chess and get out of black's coming theory. Right, well let's move into the meat of the video now, and we'll deal with 2d4, a critical move, grabbing the centre and putting the question to black's system. And I'm going to recommend the move 2e5. Now this is a direct challenge to the white centre, and white has three separate ways of dealing with e5. The first way is to take black's pawn on e5. D takes e5. In doing so, after the resulting recapture, knight takes e5, white hopes to make profit of the exposed black knight. I will prove that he is not able to do so if black plays accurately. In the second section, we'll see white blocking the centre with 3d5, whereupon I recommend black replies knight c e7, going into a temporary kind of huddle on the king's side. Now this leads to really difficult play, but I believe this variation to be more difficult to play for white than for black. Black has clear aims in mind. And I think black has two separate ways to play this, both of which give him a playable game. He can curl up into a ball and go for a King's Indian formation with d6, g6, bishop g7, and eventually f5. That's one way to play the position. Or he can try and unravel by playing knight g6 and then developing the bishop on f8 to either c5 or b4, usually with check and according to circumstances. The final choice for white, and in some senses a critical one, is if he decides to go back into a scotch with 3 knight f3. And I'll be recommending a line for black in the style of Nc6's defence, which is very rare and not too bad. Now the first variation, and a very common line, is 3 d takes e5, knight takes e5, and then knight f3. A kind of safety first move by white, which is supposed to lead to a small edge for him. I don't particularly believe that, and I recommend the move here, queen f6. Now this doesn't make any concessions to white at all. Black develops a piece. He threatens to take on f3, messing up white's pawns. And he also threatens maybe developments such as bishop c5, d6 and knight e7. Overall, that's black's plan of development, if he can achieve it. Actually, Tony Miles, in place of queen f6, has been playing bishop b4 check here and achieving good results, but I believe queen f6 to be even better. Now the reason queen f6 is so good, I think, is because it limits white's choice. Actually, white has to deal with the threat of knight takes f3 check. Now the first way is knight takes e5 by white, hoping to profit from black's exposed queen. But I don't really believe this line for white, because after only 5 moves, black has the only developed piece, queen takes e5, and I like to be ahead in development with black if I can help it. Now the only move to have been played here for white is bishop d3, presumably replacing that move. If white goes knight c3, then bishop b4, followed by, if possible, knight f6 and d5, gives black a nice active game. So bishop d3, and now I recommend the move bishop b4 check. The main idea of this move is to take away the c3 square from white's knight. A further interesting point is that black actually wants his bishop on c5 here, but he's afraid that white would have answered that move with knight c3. And the main reason he wants his bishop on c5 is that he sees that white is planning the move f4. And he wants to make life as difficult as possible for the white king in that instance. Now we come to bishop b4 check first. And the idea is that if white plays c3 now, black then plays bishop c5. And in spite of losing a move, he'll actually gain a move in a minute, because it's difficult for white to find a good square for his bishop on c1 now. And actually white's plan has got to be something like knight d2, then knight f3, then castles, then he's got to find a square for his bishop on c1. You see, it takes him an awful long time to arrange to play the move f2, f4. So in practice, after bishop b4 check, white has almost always played knight d2. Now results from this position haven't exactly favoured black in the past, but I believe black's got an improvement on his hitherto recommended move of knight f6. I don't believe that's the best way to tackle the position. Instead, I'm going to recommend an idea of Hugh Myers from the United States, which is 7d5. Myers gives 2 lines to support this move. The first line is c3 immediately. He then gives bishop d6, knight f3, queen e7, with a decent position for black, as white now has to deal with the threat of a capture on e4. The second line features white castling immediately, which seems to be best. And then Myers gives knight e7, blocking the e-file against any exposure to white's rook on f1. Knight f3, actually just retracting that move, I must mention that e takes d5 now should be answered by bishop d6, and this is a strong move, because if knight f3, then queen h5, and white actually has a few problems here in view of black's threats of bishop g4 and almost always the threat to recapture on d5, so black would have a strong attack in this position. And now back after knight e7, white plays knight f3, and now Myers gives queen h5, with a good game for black, who threatens bishop moves such as, for instance, bishop g4, and or combined with bishop d6. And black's got a nice game. For instance, he can choose which side he wants to castle on. Maybe sometimes it would be embarrassing for white if black castled queenside. The second line for white which has been played after queen f6 is a rather meek move, bishop e2. Personally, I don't think if white plays like this he can hope for much advantage at all. And I'm going to recommend the, again, rather peculiar move, bishop b4 check, to try and take away the c3 square from white's knight. Now there are three separate lines. In the first line, 6 bishop d2, white makes a mistake. For instance, black can now gain the advantage simply by playing knight takes f3 check, bishop takes f3, and queen takes b2. So we can put that variation in the rubbish bin straight away. The second line features white blocking the check with 6 knight bd2. This is slightly more dangerous for black, because black does not want his pieces set up as targets here. For instance, the bishop to be knocked back by c3 whenever white wants to, the knight to be taken, and then the queen to be knocked back. So black's got to play very accurately here, and I think the best way to do it is to play knight e7. And the idea of this is to go knight 7 to g6 and try and take control of the dark squares, for instance f4 or h4 on the king side. There hasn't been any games from this position at all. It's a new position, but I believe knight e7 is the way to tackle knight bd2, and as I say, follow up with knight g6, and of course d6 will enable black's bishop on c8 to come into the game at some point. Usually here black will castle short, but I think probably the most common move for white here will be c3. I'm absolutely convinced that this is the move 99% of your opponents are going to play if you reach this position. And we're going to follow the game Tarver against Paul Kearis, Tallinn 1969. Kearis, of course, one of the greatest players who ever lived. He was quite happy to use Nimzowitsch defence on occasion, and this is one of his successes with the line. Well, after c3, black played bishop c5. He's taken away c3 from the knight. Now he moves the bishop back to its best square, and white castled. Whereupon black played knight e7, which is more or less the recommended plan. White played knight bd2. Actually, maybe this would transpose back into the previous line. And d6 by black, letting his bishop out. White played knight b3, hitting the bishop, and the bishop just dropped away nicely to b6. And now white played king h1. Well, clearly white can see that the right way to tackle this position is to get the move f4 in at a certain point. But to do that, he's got to, first of all, move this knight on f3. I don't know where he's going to go, maybe to d4. And then to follow up with f4. That's one idea. But it's not so easy for white to find a good square for that knight. For instance, if he takes the knight on e5, then black nicely and solidly takes with his d-pawn. And it's not so easy for white to get f4 in here without weakening the pawn on e4. So king h1, a hopeful move really, hoping to get f4 in. Kearis responded accurately. He played knight takes f3. White captured back with a bishop, and then black castled. So already black has got a very comfortable game. You can't say the knight on b3 is participating much in the action. Black's bishop on b6 is strong. The other bishop on c8 can come out as and when black desires. And black himself can play for the move f5. It's not out of the question that black can play for the move f5, gaining very active play. For instance, he's only got to put his queen on e5 here and go f5, and then black's game is fantastic. Returning to the position after knight takes e5, a dangerous move for white, or supposedly dangerous, is for knight c3. A move specifically prepared by one of Britain's strongest players, James Howe, against that well-known ex-Andorran, Tony Miles, in the Isle of Man Open 1995. The point of this move is that white keeps his options open, and in particular he reserves the right to play f2, f4 at the right moment. I recommend playing the move bishop c5 here, and that's what Miles played in this game. Whereupon white played bishop f4. Now comes d6. Now there are two moves for white, worth playing. In the Howe-Miles game, white went queen d2. But we must look at the move bishop takes e5 first, going for a kind of endgame position, with the queens off. We'll now follow briefly the game Plucha versus Ibragimov, Katowice, 1992. The queens were off in a flash. D takes e5, queen takes d8, check, king takes d8, and white played knight f3. Now I think I will counsel patience as the right way to play these positions with black. You've got two bishops, and importantly the white knights have no support points in the centre. For instance, if white could establish a knight on d5 and keep it there, then black will be under severe pressure. But he can't, because black can either knock him out with c6, or just play c6 first, preventing the knight from ever reaching that point. There are no penetration points along the d file for a white rook. The black bishops cover all the squares. And importantly, I think, black can reinforce his e-pawn on e5 with the move f6, and then the knight can slot in to either e7, or the knight can go via another route, knight h6, and then either knight g4, which produces pressure against f2, or knight f7, and then maybe knight d6, covering all the sensitive points. Well, if white wants to play like that, just chopping everything off, there's not a lot you can do about it. But you can gain some comfort from the fact that you've got two bishops and a very solid position, with chances to win later on. But you must be patient. No self-respecting white grandmaster is going to do anything like that, unless they want to make a quick draw against you, in case your name's Kasparov or something like that. So, Howe played queen d2. And according to Dolmatov, this is a clear advantage to white. Howe mentions in his notes that he didn't see any advantage to white in this position. So, knight f6 by black, and white castled on the queen side. Black just kept on developing with bishop e6, just inviting white, if he wants to take on e5 and then take the queens off. Everything comes off, no problem for black. Then the bishop on c5 becomes king of the board. Howe tried knight a4. That's a rather optimistic move according to Howe, and instead of that he gives the moves f3, castles by black, knight ge2, knight c4, queen d3, and then knight h5, an interesting move by black, and he says that white doesn't really have any advantage in this position. So knight a4, black went bishop b6, and white played f3, shoring up his e-pawn. Black simply castled. Now came the move a3. I think white wants to take on b6, and he doesn't want the black rook hitting the a2 pawn. So that's the reason for that peculiar move. Black played queen e7, knight takes b6, a takes b6, knight e2. And now it's time for an assessment. Well, white's got the two bishops here, and he's managed to cover his weak pawns, his supposedly weak pawns, on e4 and a2. But according to Howell, he actually stands worse here, because black's actually better developed, and he threatens perhaps to open the game with the move d5, or maybe knight g6 first, and then d5. And Howell wasn't really alert enough to the danger inherent in this position, as you'll see. So black immediately now got onto the attack. He played knight g6, and I guess if white retreated his bishop to either g3 or e3, black was going to do the same as in the game. He played king b1 white, and now d5. This was the idea. And suddenly black has a tremendous initiative. Well, e takes d5 happened. Knight takes d5. And white played queen c1. Whereupon black went b5. And round about here, Howe felt that white even had a lost game, because it was very difficult for white to actually do anything about black's threat of b4. That's the threat, and what can white do about it? Okay, white played bishop d2, trying to escape, but black just ploughs on. b4, nice initiative. A takes b4, knight takes b4, and now the miserable move, b3. And now Miles demolishes white's position with the excellent move, knight takes c2. And this is an absolute crusher. If king takes c2, then bishop f5 check does the job. The white king's got nowhere to hide. Accordingly, Howe left to take with the queen, but then queen a3, bishop went to c3, and bishop takes b3. Howe resigned. The line of long resistance here is queen d2, but after bishop a2 check, king c2, queen b3 check, king d3, rook a d8 check, knight d4, black can simply play rook takes d4 check, and the white king's not going to survive much longer. Howell had enough of all that. He packed it in. And just to show you that game wasn't a fluke, here's a game of my own, a very recent game, against Simon Ansell, a young, strong player from the Bristol region. And it was played in the British National Club Championship in March '96. White tried to improve on Howell's play by playing knight f3 here. But I don't think such simple play meets the requirements of this complex position. Black retreated the knight to g6, and white went bishop g3, and now knight f6 was played. And again, white played what outwardly looks like a good developing move, bishop c4. Black castled, and white played queen e2. So Ansell's plan is clear. He wants to reinforce the e-pawn with his queen on e2, and castle on the queen side, followed by some sort of an attack against the black king, probably with h4 and maybe h5, exposing the g6 knight. However, black's next move is very strong and puts the whole plan out of commission. Here I played the surprising move, bishop b4, which actually, although outwardly a modest move, refutes white's plan, because he can't castle on the queen side anymore. Well, he can castle, but then bishop takes c3 would happen, and white's king would be very exposed. And the point is that if Ansell defends against the threat bishop takes c3 with his queen, for instance, either queen e3 or queen d3, then black can take that knight anyway, and white would be obliged to recapture with the b pawn in view of the weakness of his e pawn. So the net result of queen e2 is bishop b4, and I believe that black is actually better now. It's amazing, just this one move, and black suddenly has the better position. Let's go on. White castled on the king side, changing tack. But now, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and suddenly white's game is not very desirable anymore. Now another key move, knight h5. With 2 points. Firstly, black at any time can take the bishop on g3, but more than likely he's planning to bring a knight to f4 at some point, depending on circumstances. And probably black's queen, if white allows, will come out to f6, just reinforcing the f4 square. So for that reason white got a bit desperate in this position, played probably the best move actually, e5. But it's a kind of desperate move, it's a kind of bailing out move. White's trying to bail out already. But bishop g4, and the pressure's starting to build. Well, Ansel panicked at this point. He didn't understand how he could get in such a bad position with the white pieces so quickly. What he should play in this position is to e takes d6, and take his chances in the position after knight takes g3, f takes g3, queen takes d6, rook a d1, queen c5 check, king h1. Obviously black's position is clearly superior because of the pawn structure, but white does have open lines for his pieces, and maybe there'll be some tactics against the f7 square for black to worry about. I think black is clearly better here, but it has to be played with care, so probably white should have done this. However, under fire, white makes an error. e6. I'm afraid this move is too aggressive, and black refutes the idea immediately with d5. Now this is very strong, because if white moves his bishop back to either d3 or b3, then black simply rounds up the pawn on e6. If he plays rook a d1, pinning, then c6 is quite sufficient. At some point white's got to take on f7 to avoid losing a pawn, and that will open up the position for black's rook on f8 and put further pressure on the knight at f3. In the light of these comments, it's not surprising that white's position is on the verge of collapse, as you will see. Ansel took on f7, rook takes f7, white doesn't achieve anything by this exchange, apart from not losing a pawn. And then came rook f d1. Well, I could play c6 here, that would be a nice solid move, but having built up such a nice attacking position, I don't think solidity is called for here. I decided to put the boot in. Knight h f4 was played. White played queen f1. That is why he played the rook from f1 to d1, to create this horrible square for the queen, but what else could he do? Now bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and now queen g5. A much better move than c6 ever was, attacking and still protecting the d-pawn. Well, the rest is completely comprehensible. Bishop b3 was played, and now the cleanest way is just to bring everything into the attack. Black played queen h5. Seeing no satisfactory way to defend the f-pawn, white lashed out with c4, but it's not good enough. Rook a f8, c takes d5, and now it's really very simple. First the knight checks on h3 check. White can't come forward. If he comes forward he gets murdered. For instance, king g2, queen takes f3 check, king takes h3, knight f4 check, king h4, and then queen h5 mate. So that's impossible. So the king went to h1, and now not queen takes f3 check, but a far more accurate move is knight g f4, which creates the unstoppable threat of queen takes f3 and mate. Unstoppable, that is, apart from rook d3, which is what Ansel played, knight takes rook, queen takes knight, and then rook takes f3, which is an absolute crusher. Only one more move in the game, d6 check, king h8, white resigned. A typical reason for resignation might be, for instance, queen e2, and then rook takes g3, finishes nicely. Queen takes h5, and knight takes f2, mate. Well, the moral of the story must be, I guess, that not only does 5 bishop f4 give white nothing, whether he takes on e5 or not, but that if you try and improvise against Nc6's defence, the black pieces are in active enough positions for black to be able to not only hit back, but to take over the game with devastating effect, as you saw here. Now let's retract the move d6 and put back white's bishop on c1, and instead substitute the move f4 for white, which was played in Akopian versus Miles, Moscow, 1990. Now, if this type of thing was successful for white, nobody would touch Nc6's defence with a barge pole, because black's pieces just get pushed back, white's gaining space and time, white gets a superior game with ease. Yes, well, it doesn't quite work out like that. In this game, Miles played knight c6. The problem for white is, of course, that he's very weak along the diagonal from a7 to g1, and the bishop on c5 is a very strong piece at this moment. Akopian played bishop c4, setting a cheapo. Bishop takes f7 is the threat, to be followed by queen d5. Even Andorran players tend to see things like that. So Miles played d6, knight f3 by white, and Miles tried to neutralise the bishop on c4 by playing bishop e6. Bishop takes e6 happened, f takes e6, and then Akopian played knight a4, clearly realising the potential and the power of that bishop on c5. Okay, Miles is not too bothered. He played bishop b6, knight takes b6, a takes b6, and white castled on the king's side. So this, if you like, is a typical position from the f4 line. White can't really make any claims to have an advantage here. Black's quite well developed, and after knight f6, he gets a playable game. The third variation for white after knight takes e5 is the move 4f4. And indeed this move looks dangerous. The idea should be that after knight c6, and I think that's black's best move here, that white will play bishop e3, denying black the possibility of using the c5 square for his bishop. So actually black's got to find a new way of tackling the line should white play bishop e3 here. I recommend the move bishop b4 check. And the idea is that if white now plays c3, then bishop a5 is a good move. And it's a kind of neutralisation situation where at some point black's going to play bishop b6, and then the exchange of bishops will favour black because the dark squares are weak in white's camp. So let's have a look at a typical sample of play after bishop a5. I'll give two lines. In the first, white plays bishop d3. And now I think d5 is a good move. If black can get d5 in these lines, then I think he should almost always do so. The point being that if white goes e5, then black can play d4 with a perfectly respectable game. And if white takes on d5, he takes d5, then queen takes d5 gives black very free development. In the second line after bishop a5, we'll give white the move bishop c4. And now I think Queen E7 is a good move, hitting the E-pawn. In fact, the E-pawn, White's E-pawn, is a target for Black in this variation. Queen F3, Black goes D6, Knight D2 by White, Knight F6, perhaps threatening Bishop G4 here. So, H3 by White, and then simply castles on the king side. And after Knight E2 by White, in the game Ravinsky-Romanovsky, Leningrad 1926, a very old game but instructive nevertheless, Black now play Rook E8. And actually, White's starting to feel the pinch on E4, because if he goes Knight G3 now, then D5 is excellent. And in the game, Bishop D3 was played. Then Black played the excellent move Bishop F5 and had a clear advantage. So White can in fact lash out with this move F4, but I don't think it leads to very much for him. We'll look at just one more line. Back at the move F4, you'll recall that I'm recommending the move Knight C6 here. And in place of Bishop E3 last time, we'll now play Bishop C4 for White. I think virtually against anything else, Black will go Bishop C5. But here, of course, White's going to play Bishop takes F7. So actually White's setting a trap with this move. King takes F7, Queen D5 check. And White wins a valuable pawn. So don't do that. Accordingly, after Bishop C4, I'm going to recommend once again the move Bishop B4 check. And if C3, Bishop A5, and then comes Bishop E3, Queen E7, transposing to the last line, or, in place of Bishop E3, Knight F3 for instance. I mean, that looks like a sensible move, doesn't it? Bishop B6 for Black, preventing White from castling. And now an attack by White, Knight G5, whereupon a Polish analyst called Kapitaniak, who wrote a pretty comprehensive book on the Nc6 defence some time ago, gave the following line. Knight H6 by Black, defending F7. E5 by White, trying to restrict Black. And now D6, E takes D6, castles, which I think is a very good gambit idea. Difficult for White to get his king out of the middle. Black simply threatening, I think, to go Rook E8 check, which is pretty embarrassing for White, as you can see. And if White were just to play greedily here with, for instance, D takes C7, then Rook E8 check, well, what's he going to play in this position? Bishop E2, only move, isn't it? Queen takes C7, puts White into a lot of bother here. Personally, I find the move F4 a little premature. Knight C6 is a good reply. Bishop E3, I think, is White's only really critical move, trying to take the dark squares. But then Bishop B4 check, followed by Bishop A5, and then maybe at some point Bishop B6 is a good neutraliser. Black gets a good game with ease in this line, because he can go after White's E-pawn. I'm going to close this part of the video by looking at two lesser known moves by White's bishop on C1. The first of which is Bishop F4, putting the question to Black's knight. And we're going to follow the game Melanyuk-Perziwoznik, Katowice 1992, for some good play by Black. I think against Bishop F4, Black should play Knight G6. I know that's going away from the centre, but it does hit the bishop, so the bishop's got to make a decision here. And then Bishop G3 is the mainline move. Now I recommend Bishop B4 check. Once again, a key move in this line, trying to take away the C3 square from the white knight. Melanyuk answered the check with C3, as I suppose will most of your opponents. And after Bishop C5, played Knight D2. Now Black played A5, which is quite an interesting move. I think the idea of that is that he wants to retreat for the bishop along the diagonal, after, for instance, a move like Knight B3. And he plans the moves A4 and A3, trying to undermine White's position on the queen side, if he's allowed to do it. Melaniuk responded with an interesting move of his own. He played h4. And with the knight on g6, you'll soon learn that this is one of the most dangerous ideas that white can try. Because he's threatening h5. Not only does that gain space, it rather embarrasses the black knight on g6. So against a move like h4, if you've got a knight on g6, you've got to be on your guard and react accurately. Black played d6. Seems like a good reply. White's playing on the side, black plays in the centre, creates a nice little outpost for the knight on e5, if white kicks the knight. Melaniuk played h5, as expected, knight e5. And now he played bishop e2. That might seem like a peculiar move, but I suppose if we just retract that move, the move white wants to play in this position is f4. But now I think white would be in a bit of trouble, I think, after knight g4, wouldn't he? Because the e3 square is creaking. So white, not unexpectedly for a grandmaster, saw that trick and played bishop e2. Now black played knight h6. Interesting move, not blocking his queen in, and also supporting the move knight g4, should white play f4. White played knight gf3. Knight takes f3 check. Bishop takes f3. And black castled. Well, assessment coming up. Black's aim in this line seems to be once again to control the dark squares. The bishop on g3 looks a little bit out of play at this point. And I think black's leading up to the move f5, which seems to make sense of the knight on h6, brings that guy into the game, and also opens up the rook on f8. Maybe even black is threatening to go f4. That's an option, although it's not maybe an option that black should use straight away. You can keep that in reserve. But with this possibility of going f5, I think black's got a good game here. The final move for white I'll look at in this section is bishop e3. Quite a rare move and not particularly special. Black can exploit the slowness of this move with quick development. Accordingly, I recommend the move knight f6 here. And the main point of this move is to get the move d5 in as quickly as possible. If white allows that move, you should just play it. For instance, if he plays in this position f3, or some creepy move like knight d2. Just go straight ahead with d5. Accordingly, if white wants to follow up this move, bishop e3, with any continuity, he's got to try f4 here. But a very, very old game, Flechsig versus Riemann, quoted by Myers in his book, his excellent book on the Nimzowitsch defence, Breslau 1885, shows exactly why white can't hope for much success with this move. There black played knight eg4. Very good. White played bishop d4, and black smashed open the position with d5. This is the right way to play it. e5 by white. Black went knight e4, so already white's got some problems with black's leaping knights. Bishop e2. I think the main threat here for black is just to go c5. This is really embarrassing for white. Where's he going to put his bishop? So bishop e2 was played. Queen h4 check. g3. Knight takes g3. Crazy stuff. H takes g3. Queen takes g3 check. If you get your opponent down like this, then I think you should be very happy. King f1. c5. Not even taking that pawn off. Bishop b5 check. Bishop d7. Bishop takes d7 check. King takes d7. Bishop takes c5. Very miserable. Bishop takes c5. Queen takes d5 check. King e8. Queen takes c5. Queen takes f4 check. King e2. Queen e4 check. King f1. And now just rook d8. Queen b5 check was played. King f8. Queen e2. And now the crusher, rook d1 check. Queen takes d1. Knight e3 check. King e2. Knight takes d1 check. White resigned. Now, I know a lot of strong players would actually scoff at that game, saying, well, why do you include such a terrible game? Admittedly, white did play appallingly, really. But it's a typical club game in many ways, a typical club player scenario. You know, white doesn't know what he's doing in the opening. He plays active moves, or what seem to be active moves, let's say pseudo-aggressive moves, and he gets blasted away. In this case, I traced the error back to bishop e3 and f4, because the two moves don't gel. Black got in the move d5, very consistent, blew out the position, got the attack going, and everything else proceeded naturally, as it were. To sum up, if white plays d4, e5, d takes e5, knight takes e5, he's got a wide choice of moves, but none of these moves, should black play accurately, should trouble the black player. I think black's trumps in this variation are the dark squares. Generally, he tries to play on the dark squares, and he tries to use his pieces actively. For instance, an ideal setup for black would be something like this. Bishop on c5, queen on f6, pawn on d6, the knight comes round to g6, he castles on the king's side, queen moves somewhere, let's say out here, and then f5. This is a typical scenario against some deployment by white. If black can play these moves, maybe he'll flick in the move bishop b4 check to force white to play c3, take some dynamism out of the white position. Then black gets a good game along these lines. Moving on, we come to 3d5, which is going to lead to very complicated play. White blocks the centre and shows that he's happy with the closed game. I think black should be happy too, because after knight c e7, his game is quite easy to play. He's got two options. The first option is to play g6 and bishop g7, which keeps the knight on e7 for a while, and to follow up with d6 and a quick f5. This is one possibility. And the second possibility is just to come round to g6 with that knight, taking control of dark squares on the king's side. The problem for white, he's got too much choice in the way that he develops his pieces. He's got too many squares for his pieces. And if he puts his pieces on even the wrong square, one of the bishops, for instance, goes to the wrong square, then he can quickly develop a bad game. We'll see how this works as we go on with the lines. Now, by far the most common move after knight c7 for white is c4, trying to transpose to a queen's pawn type of game. Now, if you like King's Indian, play the King's Indian. But I'm going to recommend after c4 the more direct move for black, knight g6 here. I think this is the best way to tackle the line. Now, with this move, black is just basically doing one thing. He's letting his bishop on f8 into the game. And there have been so many different methods of play for white in this position, we couldn't possibly cover all of them in one video. So I'm just going to more or less show black's plan of play, black's plan of campaign in this line. If black's allowed to, he's going to play his bishop to c5. He may play it to b4 under some circumstances. But more often than not, he's going to follow up with these bishop moves with the move d6. Now, for instance, a specific move order. Let's say white plays bishop d3 here. I mean, it's perfectly possible. Now, black can play either bishop c5, which is a good move, to be followed by d6, and then maybe knight f6, and then castles. This is a typical way of playing this line, and then all the time black's got to be looking to get the move f5 in. So, for instance, he might consider just moving the knight away, knight e8, and then going for f5 as quickly as possible. Going back, after bishop d3, there's a strong argument here for playing bishop b4 check. The main argument for that is that if white now plays bishop d2, black's happy to take the bishop off. Bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, and then d6. Because this exchange facilitates f7, f5. For instance, white plays knight e2, or some such move, and now comes knight h6. And this is an interesting move. from black's point of view, because black doesn't have to waste any time retreating a knight on f6, and his simple plan is castles followed by f5. If black can achieve this type of position, he's doing very well. A further point for the check in a move sequence like this: let's say black goes check after bishop d3 and white fancies himself as an Indian player as white. He lays knight c3. Well, now comes takes on c3 check, doubling the pawns. Pawn takes, and black goes d6 again. This is an excellent position for black. It could even be considered winning positionally. White's got to find some tremendous tactics to offset black's positional grip. For instance, black's only got to play knight f6, b6, and then knight round to c5, and you can immediately see black's got all the options in this position. He can try and play against the queenside pawns, the weaklings on c3 and c4, or he may just play castles on the king side and go quickly for f5. The position's so blocked, white's not exactly setting the house on fire with active play. So, concluding this discussion of plans after c4, it seems that after knight g6, as a reply, black's in good shape, threatening, for instance, bishop c5, or, according to circumstances, or as you like really, bishop b4 check. Either of these moves, followed by d6, gives black a coherent position. Now, we should see how all this works out in a game situation. And I propose to follow the game Kaidanov versus Miles, both grandmasters, both very strong grandmasters, Palma de Mallorca, 1989, where in this position white played bishop e3. So this is a well motivated move, preventing bishop c5. Now I think almost certainly black has to check. Miles played bishop b4 check. And then came knight d2. So Kaidanov's playing very solidly at this point, not allowing any concessions, hoping that his centre gives a useful space advantage, and hoping that to outplay black in the middle game. Knight f6 by black, developing with gain of tempo, thanks to the threat on e4, and white played f3. Black played queen e7, and now came g3, which is in many ways a very subtle move. 2 points stand out. Firstly, the bishop on f1 is a liability for white in this line, so Kaidanov's got the intention of playing it out to h3 just to get rid of it, or at least to try and put pressure with it on black's position. Put that bishop on d3, not doing very much, like a sophisticated pawn bolstering the white pawn centre. Put it on h3, it looks a bit better. So that's one intention. The second point, I think, is that white's trying to strangle the black knights on the king side. Black's knights depend very heavily on the king side to create some squares. For instance, the knight might want to come to h5. The knight's looking to come to g4. The knight on g6 is looking to hop into f4 or h4. So white's trying to deny the black knight squares on the king side, and he may well follow up with the move h4, cutting out even more squares for the black knights. So it's a start, g3, I think, of a rather ambitious policy for white. Miles proves that there's more to the black position than meets the eye. He kicks off with c6, and this is a move which very much conforms to chess logic. If white's playing on the flank, on the king side, then black plays in the centre. Bishop h3 was played, and black castled on the king side. Now white played a3. Bishop came to c5. Typical idea in this line, trying to swap the dark square bishops. And white played knight f1. Well, it's all very sophisticated, but I think that white's play is rather slow here. Of course, white's hoping that his strong centre will prevent black from busting open the position. And it's all very nice putting your pieces on these nice squares, the bishop on h3 and all the pawn play, but it's rather slow, and accordingly black opens up the position to his advantage. Miles now plays a very strong move, probably the best move of the game. b5. White played b4, and now a slightly surprising move by black, bishop d4. Bishop took on d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4, and then came b takes c4. White tried to drive a wedge into the position with d6, and black played queen e5. White played knight e2, and black continued his policy of opening up the game with a5. I think now you can start to see the scale of the problem for white. He's got no good place for his king, whereas black's king sits very safely on g8. Ultimately, that leads to white's downfall. Knight e3, so Kaidanov's trying to rescue the situation by development, but black continues to blast open the position before white can castle. A takes b4. Excellent move. Knight takes c4. Queen h5. No more queen trades. Black keeps the queens on in order to keep his initiative alive. Bishop g2, and then c5. So, queen e3. And then bishop a6. Once again, a very active move, preventing white from safetying his king. Knight went to b6, and rook went to b8. Well, Kaidanov now tried some sacrifice with a takes b4, but it wasn't quite good enough. I think in this position he has to play knight a4, but even then, after rook fc8, black's got an excellent game. So, a takes b4, but Miles quickly refuted this idea. Rook takes knight, b takes c5, and rook c6, holding white up. The main point of this is if that white were now to go knight d4, black can go queen takes c5, pinning the knight. So white has a very poor position here. He's probably lost. And in fact, white did lose in only a few more moves. We have to see them. Kaidanov played rook a5. Knight e5 happened, with terrible pressure against the d3 square. Knight f4. Queen g5. Queen d4. Rook b8, activating the last piece. Rook a1, fairly miserable move. Then came h6, a rather sadistic move by Miles actually that. Just challenging white to find a decent move here. Rook takes a6, equivalent to resignation. Rook takes a6, castles, knight c6, queen c4, and now just rook a5. White resigned. A very convincing win for black. Moving away from the positional niceties of c4, we progress to a blunt attacking try, 4f4, which might be tried quite often at club, county, regional levels. I recommend e takes f4, bishop takes f4, knight g6. After all, isn't it black's intention to take over the dark squares in this variation? Now white's reply is forced. He can't now play bishop e3 because of queen h4 check. In fact, he's got to stop that move. Accordingly, white must play in this position bishop g3. And now comes knight f6. White plays knight c3, and we see the reason why black delayed the development of the bishop on f8. He could have put it on c5 last move, but he was waiting for knight c3 so he could reply with bishop b4, putting the pressure on. And we'll follow the game Oliveira Rossetto, Argentina 1964, where white played queen d4. Black seized his opportunity to take on c3 immediately. Bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, and black played d6, after which you can already say that black has won the structural war. Look at white's pawn structures all over the place. So it's not surprising that already black holds the advantage here. White tried bishop b5 check, bishop d7, and then bishop d3. Seems to be a pretty meaningless manoeuvre that for white. The only thing he's done is to take away the d7 square from the knight, but he's also developed black's position for him. So it didn't help white at all, that check. Black castled, knight f3. Now another key move in this line, knight h5, which does two things. First of all, puts the pressure on the dark squares on the white's king side. The f4 square can be occupied. Black's queen is given access to either e7 or f6. Depends how black feels, really. But that's an excellent move, knight h5. And also, of course, it puts the pressure on white's bishop. Is white really going to let black take the bishop? He didn't. He played bishop f2. And then came bishop g4, h3, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, knight e5. That covers the f6 square for the black queen to come out. I guess that's black's plan, actually. If white plays queen e3, then queen f6, and that's really excellent for black because the knight's slipping into f4. Look at those knights, they're creaming white, absolutely crushing him. So that's black's plan. So poor old white had to sacrifice a pawn. He played castles on the queen side. Dreadful move. Knight takes f3, queen e3, knight e5. And we can close our discussion of this line by saying that here, black is just winning. A maniacal looking alternative for white after knight c7 is h4. But actually that's a move that's positionally well founded, because white's actually anticipating the arrival of a black knight on g6, whereupon that knight will swiftly be sent back with h5. And if the knight doesn't go to g6, then doesn't black's position remain all blocked up? Well, that's the logic of it, but I believe that black now should play f5. I think this is the right reply to white's h4 move, because it starts to bring the knight on e7 back into the game, and if white's playing on the side, again, black should play in the centre. So he starts to put pressure against the e4 pawn. Right, let's have a look at the analysis from this position. Knight c3, d6, and then there haven't been many master games from this position, as one might expect. Bishop g5 has been recommended. I'm not sure I see this is so dangerous for black, and now I recommend the move h6, not fearing queen h5 check. Of course, if white wants to play that stupid move, he can. Black plays g6, and then the queen has to retreat, because white would be forced into going bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, goodbye to the white queen, bye-bye, and you've only conceded a couple of moves to black. So after h6, if you want to make sense of bishop g5, the only way I can see that white can do this is to play bishop takes e7, whereupon I recommend that black takes back with the queen. Queen h5 check now, queen f7, queen takes f7 check, king takes f7, and I think black's okay here. The plan is knight f6 and bishop e7, just simple piece play, and retracting those moves. If white tries to get at black's soft spot immediately with, for instance, knight b5, then I think just c6, and this seems alright for black. For instance, d takes c6, b takes c6, bishop c4, and now king e7, whereupon the knight must move, and knight f6 follows. So I think h4 should be answered by a quick f5, then black gets a good game. Continuing, white could play g3 in this position. Not many whites will play this, but it's a rather subtle idea. It's waiting for black to reveal his hand. It's a useful move for white. If black plays knight g6, h4 comes into contention as an option. Black shouldn't be afraid of this. The game Kapingut Nikolaevsky, USSR Championship 1971, shows why. Bishop c5 happened, inviting h5. It was quite amazing to me that white didn't play that now. But after h5, black simply goes back. Not too many problems. d6 is coming, f5 is coming, with familiar play. That's okay for black. Returning to the position after bishop c5, Kapingut played knight d2. But then came h6, knight b3, bishop b6, a4, a6, knight f3, d6, knight fd2, trying to come to c4 maybe, knight f6, preventing that, bishop e2, black castled, white went bishop f3, and black played c6. I think black should always be aware of the possibility of c6. If you can do that, for instance, if white's centre hasn't been reinforced with c4, then c6 can be an option. Well, black went on to win this game in 73 moves. Here, he's got reasonable chances. The final move in this section I'm going to consider is bishop e3 by white. And this was played in the game Kamsky versus Bisguier, New York 1989. Knight f6 was played, f3, and Bisguier played knight g6. Now Kamsky played c4. So his eventual hope is to swamp the black position by using his pawns correctly. Bishop b4 check was played, knight c3, and now Bisguier played a new idea. He played b6 in this position. The motive for that move is clear. Black wants to be able to play bishop c5 at the right moment and take away the bishop. A familiar idea in a slightly different setting. And this, remember, against one of the strongest players in the world. Queen d2 was played by white and black played d6. Bishop d3, bishop c5, and knight e2. I guess this is how many of your opponents will play. Just developing their pieces, waiting for something to turn up. You've got your plan in order, you're exchanging off the right pieces, you've got good squares for your knights on the king side, black can be happy. Let's just see how this game went on. Black played knight d7. White played g3, familiar idea. Bishop takes e3. Queen takes e3. And knight c5 was played. Actually, just retracting that move. I wonder whether a5 is a better move. That's another possibility. Just securing the c5 square for the knight. I don't know, that might be better. But anyway, Bisguier played knight c5. Probably white should play b4 here, actually. Maybe exploiting black's last move. But anyway, he played h4. Then came knight e7. White kept his bad bishop, slightly surprising. Bishop c2, and then a5. b3 was played. And black played f5. Well, black's position stands or falls with this move. So, e takes f5. Bishop takes f5. White castle on the queen side. Bishop takes c2 was played. That wasn't strictly necessary. Black could have castled. King takes c2. Queen d7. Black's comfortable and went on to win. Very good victory. The final moves of which you can find in the booklet. And actually, as a final thought on this game, if we go back to the position where black's about to give check, you remember white played knight c3. Black doesn't have to play b6. I mean, I guess a good idea for black is just to go bishop takes c3, check in this position, and after b takes c3, d6. And now white probably has to play c5. This is the only move. If he doesn't play c5, black locks up with b6 and knight d7. I'm not going to go on with the analysis after c5, but I do say, instead of Bisguier's b6, that this is a possibility for black. Presumably black castles here. Unclear. That's an option. Summarising. I believe that the positions where white blocks things up, with d5, knight e7, are not too difficult to play for black as long as he's alert. Generally the knight goes to g6. Almost certainly the bishop on f8 will come out to either c5 or b4 check. Remember, black's aim in this position is to try and exchange the bishop on f8 for the bishop on c1, if he can, which leaves white with the traditionally bad bishop on f1, with the central pawns locked on white squares. That's the positional aim. Tactically, black can look for moves like f5 at any stage. f7, f5, that is the move to get in if you like a tactical game. If you can play that move, play it. We come now to a crunch position in this line after e5, where white plays 3 knight f3, transposing to the Scotch. Now, formerly, a lot of black players weren't too afraid of the Scotch, but Garry Kasparov has actually moulded the Scotch into a fearsome attacking weapon, and he's made the line a lot more popular. So you have to know what to do if white goes knight f3 and d4, or this way round, d4 followed by knight f3. I'm going to recommend practical lines for black, lines which are little known and lines which transpose back into kind of Nc6 territory. Particularly the first one. After e takes d4, knight takes d4. In this position I recommend the rather unusual move, queen f6. Now the reason I recommend this move is, first of all, it's not at all bad, there's nothing wrong with it, and secondly, you'll see from the play proceeding from this position that it's very familiar. Now actually white has only one good move to put black under any pressure at all in this position, and that's knight b5. There are other options for white, such as for instance knight b3. Knight f3 has been played. Bishop e3. But against each, black's plan of play is clear. He goes bishop c5, or he may go bishop b4 check, as he sees fit, followed by bishop a5. And after he moves his bishop, knight e7, d6, and castles on the king's side comes into consideration. That's the way for black to play against these lesser alternatives. So to knight b5, and then I think bishop c5 is the best move, threatening checkmate. But the main idea of bishop c5 is not to checkmate white, is that after queen e2 you can go bishop b6, protecting the sensitive square at c7. And now the main line goes knight to c3, knight ge7, and bishop e3, trying to take advantage of the weakness at c7. And now the best move for black here, and the one which keeps him on the board, is bishop a5. So it is quite similar to Nc6 defence ideas. And we'll follow the game Kuprejcik versus Ney, USSR 1975, where white castles on the queen side in this position. Right, black tried to give the knight a kick here, playing a6. I think that's a good idea to get rid of that knight as quickly as possible. And white played knight d5. White wasn't interested in retreating his knight. Okay, knight takes knight is forced, knight takes d5, and then e takes d5 was played. A takes b5, interesting move. White played bishop d4, discovered check, queen e7. D takes c6 was played. D takes c6. Queen takes e7 check. King takes e7. Bishop takes g7. Rook g8. Bishop d4. Bishop b6. And this is a level position. The bishop on c8 can come to e6. White's got to do something about his pawn on a2. For instance, what if he plays bishop takes b6 here? C takes b6, a3. Then bishop e6. For instance, after g3, black can continue with rook d8 or something like that. That's okay, because his pieces are so active. So I believe this line to be perfectly playable for black. The Gordon Gambit begins after the moves e takes d4, c3. And again, we'll continue with a practical approach for black. Now, acceptance of this gambit is perfectly possible, but you have to know a lot of theory. I'm going to concentrate on a simple way to get a perfectly reasonable game and to cut out most of white's attacking ideas. You can play like that. If you want to learn the other lines where black takes all the pawns, braves an attack, you can do that, but you can find those in the theory books. A practical approach suffices for this video, and I'm going to concentrate on d5. I think this is a perfectly good move. Black gets his pieces developed with ease. The main line runs e takes d5, queen takes d5, and then c takes d4. Now, knight f6, knight c3, and now the pin bishop b4. Right, now bishop e2 is generally played, and I'm going to recommend the move knight e4 in this position. Bishop d2, and then bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and the simplest way for black here is to play knight takes d2. Black recaps with the queen, and both sides castle. Well, this position is perfectly good for black. He swapped off the right pair of pieces, and the further continuation of the game, Klovan Averbach, USSR Championship 1969, shows the way forward. Firstly, black retreated his queen to d6, getting onto the dark squares. White hasn't got a dark square bishop, he can't shift the queen so easily. Rook a b1, trying to pin down the bishop on c8. Nice and careful move, b6. And white played bishop d3. Now came another careful move by black, h6. Rook fe1 was played, and black just played bishop d7. Rook e3 was played, and black played rook a e8. So there you are, a nice safe way to play against the Goring gambit. Most of the gambitier's ideas have been neutralised in this position. I think black's idea is to exchange one pair of rooks. For instance, if white goes rook b e1 here, black takes on e3. And if queen takes e3, then queen a3 causes some problems. Well, at least it activates the black queen. And if rook takes e3, well, black can choose between bishop g4, which is not a bad move. Rook e8 must be considered, although it's a little bit passive, but again, that probably leads to an equal game. Or knight a5, but that's a bit more risky, because that lets the white knight into e5. So probably of all these moves, rook e8 is the most correct, but bishop g4 might spice things up a little bit. I hope you'll agree we've dealt comprehensively with black's ideas in the position after d4, e5. And you've got a nice, safe, practical line against both the Scotch and the Goring gambit as well. I think that e5 is a perfectly viable move, and that black can play it with confidence. It's certainly safer than d5, but it leads to no less interesting positions. Perhaps black doesn't concede the initiative as lightly in the line after e5 as he does in the line after d5, and that's why, ultimately, that move e5 should be preferred. The second important alternative for white after knight c6 is to knight f3. Now I'm sure most white players who play this move will be hoping that you're going to play 2e5, transposing back into something that they know. I mean, actually black can do this, and you can argue that you've avoided the king's gambit, so to that extent it's a success from black's point of view. But I believe that we should stick with the Nc6 move order here, which is 2d6. I think this is the way to play. The main line now runs 3d4, and black should play knight f6, whereupon white usually plays knight c3. Just retracting that move for the moment, we'll imagine that some aggressive white players might do this. d5. This is possible, but not particularly good. After this, black should play knight e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and then bishop b5 check, a move recommended by Tigran Petrosian. He gives bishop d7, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, f3, reasoning that white's got rid of his so-called bad bishop and that he has a space advantage conferred on him by the pawn at d5. Well, I'm not so sure I believe this assessment, because black's developed two pieces already, and I think the move e6 here is perfectly satisfactory. In fact, more than that, leads to a good position for black. Black is in a good position to develop his bishop, maybe the bishop will come to c5. That's slightly embarrassing for white. And what's white going to do here? If he takes on e6, then I think queen takes e6 is a good move, with rook d8 coming up. I don't see that white in any way is inhibiting black's development by playing in this manner. So the line with d5, an immediate d5, I think is premature. On now to the main line. And after 3 knight f6, as I say, white almost always goes knight c3, whereupon black should play bishop g4. And now there are 3 main moves for white. In ascending order of difficulty for black, we have, firstly, d5. The second move I'll consider is bishop e3. And the final move, and in some senses the most critical, at least the reason why a lot of black players don't play this line, bishop b5, pinning the black knight. But I don't consider any of these moves to be dangerous for black. I think black can whip up good chances against each. Returning to the position after bishop g4, white's first fifth move alternative is d5. Again, I feel this move's a little bit premature. It's not played much by top-class masters. The only example I can find of it with grandmasters is the game Sokolov versus Storey from the USSR Rest of the World match in London, 1984. And we'll follow this game for a little while, just to show you the chances that black can drum up against d5. I think black should retreat in this position, knight b8, rather than go knight e5. There are complications after knight e5. When white plays knight takes e5, bishop takes d1, bishop b5 check. I don't really see why we should get involved in all that when knight b8 is a safer and more respectable alternative. So returning to knight b8, and in Sokolov-Storey, white played the perfectly natural move bishop e2, whereupon black played g6, which kind of returns to a perk defence. Now black's main idea against this particular white setup is to get the move c6 in. The general plan is to bring the knight on b8 to d7, the bishop comes to g7, black castles, and then he can deploy his major pieces as follows. The queen comes out to the queen side with queen a5, and the rook on f8 goes to c8. Maybe the rook goes to b8. This is black's general plan of campaign against innocuous white play. Now let's see if Sokolov could interrupt black's plan. After g6, white played knight d4, and Storey took on e2, bishop takes e2, queen takes e2. Now the first key move, c6. Not threatening to take on d5 yet, I think, but at least keeping that option in mind. Bishop g5 was played by white, bishop g7. White castled on the queen side, black castled on the king side, just announcing to white that he's not afraid of an opposite sides castling situation. White played f4, and black brought his queen out to b6. So he's leaving his knight on b8 for the moment. He considers developing the rook on f8 to c8 as a priority here, because that helps the queenside attack. White played rook he1, black rook c8. White played knight f3 here, whereupon Storey played knight a6. Now white, with his nice centralised position, feels he should be going somewhere, so he played e5. Black took on e5, and Sokolov ploughed on with d6. Then came e takes f4. Black had to face d7, rook f8, queen takes e7. And now Storey unleashed the power of his bishop on g7 by playing knight to d5, uncovering an indirect attack against the b2 square. White defended with queen a3, and black brought his knight on a6 into the game with knight a b4. This is in effect an exchange sacrifice. As you can see, after knight takes d5, knight takes d5, d8 equals queen, rook f takes d8, bishop takes d8, rook takes d8. Here, black has plenty of compensation for the exchange, and went on to win in 57 moves. Summarising, I think the move d5 is no better or worse than either bishop e3 or bishop b5 in this position. But it leads to a very murky game after knight b8. Perhaps the best that white can do is transpose to a classical perk. Certainly black's plan is easy to play. Black plays g6, bishop g7 and castles. Generally he plays c6. Most often the knight on b8 will come to d7, and then he can develop his major pieces with queen a5, rook c8 and play down the queenside files. Now we come to the move 5 bishop e3, a move favoured by Nigel Short amongst others. White develops his bishop centrally, supports his pawn centre and doesn't weaken his position. It must be a good move. An equally good reply for black is to play e6 here, with the following variations. The game Short Laco, Dortmund 1995 now proceeded h3, bishop h5, and then a very funny move, a3, which Short gives as a novelty in the latest Informator, number 64. Laco responded to that move with bishop e7. Short went bishop d3, perhaps that's why he played a3, to stop black from playing knight b4 in this type of position. And now Short recommends bishop g6 with the idea of d5, and he says this is okay for black. Returning to the position after e6, another line for white is h3, bishop h5, bishop b5, as played in the game Cheskovsky-Miles, Palmer 1989, which continued a6. I think it's important to give that bishop a nudge. Bishop a4, knight d7, d5, and now Miles played knight a5. White went queen e2, and black played b5, bishop b3, e5. Well, the position looks very much as though the game started 1 e4 e5 now. Certainly the knight on a5 will take on b3 in the very near future. Black won this game in 38 moves. Again, you can find the continuation in the booklet. The most common fifth move for white, and the reason most black players don't play this line, is bishop b5. But I think this move's seriously overrated. I've actually played this position a couple of times with black against strong players and had no difficulty whatsoever. And in fact, Tony Miles keeps on chalking up the points with black from this position. He's absolutely delighted when his opponents play bishop b5. He's had tremendous success against this move. Let's try and see why. Certainly, black should give this bishop a kick here, a6. And it's normal for white to take on c6. Bishop takes c6, check, b takes c6. Also normal for white to give this bishop a kick on g4, h3, and the bishop goes back to h5. Laco gives bishop g5 as the best move for white, and he claims this move leads to an advantage, an indisputable advantage. The idea is that white's going to take on f6 at some point and mess up the black pawns, whereupon the two knights will supposedly prove superior to two bishops. He gives some analysis. I won't reproduce all of it, but I'll just show you a line which I think is not correct. In the game Laco versus Teska, Linz 1995, black played rook b8 in this position. But I don't believe that's the best move. I think instead black should play queen b8 in this position. It makes more sense to me to activate the queen, and it's important in one of Laco's supposedly advantageous lines. Now he gives two moves for white. Firstly, he gives bishop takes f6. Mistake. black plays queen takes b2 in reply, hitting the knight. And if knight a4, then queen a3. And I think black survives this position. Not only survives, but emerges with an extra pawn. So I don't think white should take on f6 straight away. So after queen b8, Leko gives a rather miserable move, rook b1. I don't believe that white can play for an advantage in this way against Nc6's defence. So on we go. He gives e6 here. And then bishop takes f6. G takes f6. And now he gives d5 with the following line. C takes d5. E takes d5. e5. Queen e2. Advantage to white. Presumably because of black's palsied pawn structure. Replacing the position to that after g takes f6, now white plays d5 again. This pawn structure, this nice little castle of pawns there in the centre, I like that pawn position for black. Black's very, very strong in the centre of the board. And I think a good move for black here is the move c5, which cuts out the d4 square from white's queen and white's knight on f3. And also, I think it's difficult now for white to find a decent plan, a decent way to play for the advantage. For instance, I analyse g4 by white, bishop g6. And now knight h4 is possible, but doesn't look like anything special for black. Black has bishop h6 here. That's possible, activating the bishop. Or black can consider queen b4. In either case, he has decent control over the centre of the board. White might choose g4, bishop g6, knight d2 here, hoping to blot out the bishop on g6 with pawns. But now I think h5 is a decent move, to be followed up by bishop h6, activating the bishop. It's very important that in this line the d6 pawn is solidly protected by the pawn on c7. White's plan is maybe to redirect the knight via c4 to a5 and round to c6, but that takes a long time to enact. Perhaps best of all for black, after knight d2, is h5, and if now f3, then h takes g4, f takes g4, queen b4. One of the reasons why black put his queen on b8 in the first place. And now I think black's threatening to creep in by playing, for instance, a move like queen d4. And this move, this idea, connected with bishop h6, black's two bishops and the open h-file, should give black his fair share of the chances in this position. Right, now returning to the position before Leko's recommended move bishop g5, the main line for ages has been queen e2 by white. White's not too bothered if black takes on f3 at any point really, if he can recapture with the queen. And he just activates his queen, maybe preparing bishop g5, maybe threatening to castle long at some point. White can always castle short if the going gets tough. But anyway, the queen's quite nicely placed on e2 because it eyes up the pawn at a6 there, and maybe queen c4 can be a threat at some point. So that's the logic behind queen e2. Okay, black should respond to this move with e6. And now there are a couple of moves for white. The first move, and a move a lot of players will play, is the natural castles on the king side. Now I don't believe this is so dangerous for black, and I'll show you why. Black should just play bishop e7, normal development. And then white suddenly finds he hasn't really got a decent square for this bishop on c1. Well, obviously you can put it on certain squares. It can go to e3. It can go to g5. White can play b3 and bishop b2. But in each case, black's plan is the same. He's going to get the move d5 in as quickly as possible. And just to show you how this might work, let's say white plays b3 here, I mean just for sake of argument. Now d5. And if e5, knight d7, and black follows up with a quick c5. This is the way the black position works. And what you find is black's actually getting a good variation of the French defence, or even the Caracan defence, where with his c-pawn, this front c-pawn exchanges itself for the d-pawn. Let's take these two pawns off for the moment. Then black's got another c-pawn to gain the centre a bit later on. So if black can get d5 in and follow up with a quick c5, and this is the way his position works, I must reiterate that, then he will get a good game. The two bishops gradually come into their own. So if white wants anything from this position, he's got to play aggressively. The first move we'll look at is g4 here. Okay, bishop g6. And now we'll follow the game Lichterink Miles, Vikings-A 1984, because I think it's quite interesting. White played bishop g5 here, pinning. Miles played bishop e7, unpinning. And white castled on the queen side. A plausible line of play, is it not? Well, it would be, except black's got a tactical shot which gives him the better position here. Actually, in the game, Miles missed this shot. He only found it later. Miles played h6, which looks normal. But actually, black can play knight takes e4 in this position, which is a good move. For instance, Miles suggested knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, this is the whole point. Bishop takes e7, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, king takes e7, queen takes e6, queen d7, queen takes d7, king takes d7. And Miles says he feels black has a slight advantage here. Maybe that's a bit excessive, but certainly black is not worse. In place of this tactical shot, and if you don't want to play h6, Hugh Myers has actually analysed another crazy move here, and that's knight d5. It's quite a remarkable move, really. He gives e takes d5, bishop takes g5 check, king b1, c takes d5, knight takes d5, castles on the king side, knight takes g5, queen takes g5, knight e3, and now he gives bishop e4 here, with the idea f3, bishop b7. But we just replace the bishop on g6 and the pawn on f2. I think rook fb8 in this position is even better. For instance, white plays h4 now, queen f4, nice square for the queen, and if white plays h5, then bishop e4. And white can't play f3, well actually white's losing this position because he's dropping the exchange, I think. Or if he's not dropping the exchange, then he's got to play an uncomfortable move like rook h3, whereupon black can choose between doubling on the b line with his rooks, or just playing a5 here. In either case, he's got a good position because of the nice position of his pieces. Going back now to the position after e6, we were discussing the move g4, bishop g6. And now we'll follow the game Hulak versus Miles, Indonesia, 1982 for a little while, where in this position, white tried knight h4. Now comes the key move for black, and one you should study very carefully, d5. This Miles gives an exclamation mark, claiming that it at least equalises. Hulak played knight takes g6, h takes g6, letting black's rook into the game, bishop g5, bishop e7, bishop takes f6, and now Miles played a very important move here, g takes f6. And one of the attractions of this line for me is the arrangement of black's pawn structure. I like all these central pawns. Shields the king very, very effectively. Hulak tried to castle on the queen side, and Miles played played queen d6, which he claims is slightly advantageous to black. Because, well, let's see. Black can put his king here on d7, and then he can choose between besieging white's h-pawn on h3 by doubling rooks on the h-file, or he may switch to a b-file attack with rook b8 and power down against white's king. Well, actually, white won this game after many ups and downs, but black had a winning position, and you can see this winning position and the game in its entirety in the booklet. Returning to the position after e6, a slight cloud was cast on this variation by the game Sachs, Kinderman, Lucerne 1985. After e6, white played bishop g5 in this position. Black played bishop e7, and Sachs took on f6 straight away. His idea was that after bishop takes f6, g4, bishop g6, queen c4, black's queen had to go to a less than ideal square on d7. In fact, the normal and best square for the black queen in this line is b8. If black can get the queen to b8 in this line, then he's doing okay. But that was Sachs's idea, to force the black queen to a slightly inferior square. Showing you that plan again, I'm going to suggest an improvement for black. And that is, if white takes on f6 immediately, to capture back with the g-pawn. I know this is a worse position for black than before. With the bishop on f8, we've met analogous positions, because with the bishop on f8, of course, black can consider playing his bishop out to h6. But, putting the bishop back on e7, black's got other advantages to his position. Firstly and foremostly, I think he threatens the move now d5. I think this is his main positional threat. For instance, if white were now to castle on the queen side, black would certainly play d5 here, because that cuts out a lot of white's tricks. And now, how is white to play for the advantage in this position? For instance, black's first threat is bishop b4, which is slightly embarrassing from white's point of view. The knight's got no really ideal squares. Putting the bishop back. What is white's move? Let's say g4, bishop drops back to g6, and if white plays h4, then I think bishop b4 is a good move. If white tries to take advantage of black's position a la Sachs, with for instance g4, bishop g6, queen c4, then I think queen d7 is not quite as bad as it was in the Sachs game. Firstly, I think black's pawns protect the king very effectively. There's a threat of d5. I'm sure that's more effective now that the white queen has set itself up as a target on c4. And finally, if white plays d5 himself, then he faces the loss of a pawn here. C takes d5, e takes d5, and is it out of the question here that black can play bishop takes c2? Well, obviously the danger in that move is that white may play knight d4, but if black doesn't wish to enter those complications, then just e5. And after castles on the queen side, maybe f5 is possible. And the two bishops are starting to come into the game. The final alternative for white at move 9, in place of g4 or bishop g5, is bishop f4. A natural move played in the game Kozinski Miles Groningen Open 1989. Shouldn't lead to too much for white, it's just a natural developing move. Miles played bishop e7, white castled on the queen side. This seems to be the way to go for white if he wants anything. Now black played a key move, queen b8. In every sense, this is as important as the move d5 in this line. Both moves are key ideas. If black can get one or other, or even both of these ideas in, then he generally gets a good game. Kozinski played g4, bishop g6 and h4. Now generally speaking, black should answer this type of plan. It's quite common for white to do this with h5. Kozinski played g5, knight came to d7, and white went knight d2. Now came the move queen b4. whereupon white played a trappy move, a3. Now when I first looked at this position I thought, well, why can't black capture on d4? But I guess Tony Miles has seen that after bishop e3, queen e5, knight c4, the black queen disappears from the board, never to return. So, a3, queen b7, fair enough, queen c4 by white, castles. Of course, it's not clear that white's gaining anything from playing a3. I mean, you might see that as a weakening of the queenside position. Rook h e1, rook f b8, queen b3, hoping to stem the attack, knight b6, white went bishop g3 to push his f-pawn, and now black played d5, with a completely unclear game. Very difficult to call this position, don't know who's better. The better player will win the game, that's for sure, and indeed, black went on to win in 42 moves. Summing up, if white plays 2 knight f3, I don't think that black should be intimidated. Certainly he shouldn't go back into a mainline e5 game. I think black should strike out on an independent course with d6, as has Tony Miles on many occasions with excellent results. I think he can count on obtaining an excellent game if he does so, and he will certainly, almost certainly, know more about the variation than will white. Unless, of course, you happen to be playing Tony Miles, which is a bit unlikely. We turn now to unusual second moves by white. You won't have to face these moves very often, but it's as well to have some idea what you're doing if you happen to come up against these ideas. The first move we're going to look at is 2 knight c3. Obviously not at all a bad move for white. Perhaps the only drawback of this move is that black, if he wishes, can go straight back into a symmetrical Vienna, which doesn't present any particular problems to him. But if you want to strike out on an independent course, then I recommend the move 2 knight f6 here. We'll continue d4, because that is the main line. And now d6. Whereupon if white now plays knight f3, we're back in our main line after bishop g4. The only other moves to have been played in this position are firstly f4, which looks aggressive, but I think a good move now for black is bishop g4. And however white follows up, for instance if you go bishop e2 here, you can play bishop takes e2, knight g takes e2, and now e5, with reasonable chances. Returning to the position after d6, if white tries d5 here, then black should retreat with knight b8, and follow up with c6, g6 maybe, bishop g7. As an example, we're going to look at a snippet from the game Zaitsev versus Lutikov, USSR Championship 1969. White played d5, knight b8, and bishop g5 was played. Then came c6, bishop e2, queen b6, rook b1, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, and both sides castle. White played knight d2, and black played knight b d7. It looks as though white's building up some sort of an advantage here, and he played king h1 with the intention of going f4. But appearances are deceptive. Black played c takes d5, e takes d5, a6. Now it begins to look something like a Sicilian or a Schmidt-Benoni type of structure. Knight c4, queen c7, a4, b6, knight e3, knight c5, bishop h4, bishop d7, white played rook a1, protecting his a-pawn. And now came knight f to e4. An interesting move, leaving the pawn on e7 hanging. Knight takes e4. Knight takes e4. f3 by white. Knight c5. c3. And now Myers recommends the move a5, with at least equality for black, based on the tactic bishop takes e7, bishop takes a4. In this way, black reaches a perfectly satisfactory game. Now we come to two very rare bishop moves by white, the first of which is bishop c4. Now that looks like a typical move of a schoolboy actually, a weak player. But actually it has been played by masters, and both grandmasters Kyrgios and Knark have actually drawn against this move, so it's not to be underestimated. I think the best that black can do is to aim for d5 as quickly as possible. And the way to do this is to go to knight f6 first of all, hitting the e-pawn. White plays knight c3, and now the most accurate move seems to be e6. White plays d3 perhaps, and then you go straight through with the move d5. Well, I think we can stop here by saying black has a satisfactory game. And if we just retract the position a couple of moves, to the position where white played knight c3, I wonder whether knight takes e4 is possible, with what I hope should be familiar lines. For instance, bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, knight takes e4, and now e5 with reasonable play. This seems okay for black. Or knight takes e4, d5, bishop d3, d takes e4, bishop takes e4, and now several moves are possible. Myers suggests queen d6, that's possible, but surely either e5 or g6 are possible. So there's another idea for black. Seems reasonable as well. The second of these very peculiar bishop moves is bishop b5. Now you won't have to face this one very often, but when you do, I recommend a6. And however white plays here, he's not going to get a great position. I think probably the best is just to take the knight. But let's see that. Bishop takes knight, b takes c6, d4, d5, for instance knight c3. This is just a very likely move order. e6, knight e2, knight f6. What's going on here? I tend to think that black will be okay. He's got two bishops, some sort of stake in the centre. Okay, he's got double pawns, but c5 is coming. So this looks reasonable for black. And if white insists on originality after a6, for instance he goes bishop a4, then black can consider a sequence like b5, bishop b3, knight f6 hitting the pawn, and if white plays d3, black goes e6 with a quick d5 to come. Maybe he'll preface d5 by going knight a5, exchanging knight for bishop. That can't be bad for black. In fact, it must be quite good for him. So I don't think either bishop c4 or bishop b5 give white very much. I mean, these are cop-out moves. And what of the move to d3? Well, it's certainly not possible for black to get any advantage against this sort of move. What he should do is take himself out in the centre. I recommend 2e5. I mean, this is a perfectly good move. And then follow up normally with, for instance, bishop c5 and knight f6. I mean, what can one say about such a position? This is perfectly reasonable for black. Just follow general principles. Develop. White can't get anything with a passive move like d3. The best he can get is a reverse King's Indian or Philidor. The final move we're going to consider for white in this section is 2f4. I think at whatever level you play the Nimzowitsch defence, you're going to meet this move at one time or another. So it's as well to know what to do. And I'm going to recommend the move 2e5 here. I wouldn't have done that until I saw an article by Tony Miles in a recent New in Chess yearbook. And in fact this position transposes back to the King's Gambit. Miles has got an amazing idea in mind. The idea is that after knight f3 by white, the move f5 actually turns out to be quite good for black. A few simple lines illustrate why. The first line is the so-called natural knight c3. This seems to give black a very good game after f takes e4, knight takes e4, and then just d5. And when white's knight retreats, or wherever it goes, black goes e4. Let's see this. Knight c3, e4, knight comes into e5, and I think simplest of all is just knight f6, with excellent development and a good centre. The second line is e takes f5, when I think black gets a good variation of the fault beer by going e4 here. For instance, white plays knight e5, and now simply knight f6, with d5 to come. Interestingly, Miles gives d3 as white's best move in this position, but from a King's Gambitier's point of view, that's not particularly inspiring, is it? I mean, you don't play the King's Gambit to block in your bishop on f1, do you? I think black should reply in kind, really, just d6, knight c3, knight f6 is safest, followed by bishop e7 and castles, with an equal position. Perfectly okay for black. Going back to 2f4 then, I recommend challenging in the centre with e5, transposing to a King's Gambit, a variation thought inferior for black until Miles came up with the bamboozling move f5. Summarising, none of white's second moves, apart from 2d4 or 2 knight f3, pose any sort of challenge to Nc6's defence. They're just kind of despairing moves by white to get out of black's theoretical grip. I don't think black should be worried by any of them. Well, what did you think? Not bad going for a supposedly second-rate opening, was it? One thing's for sure, Nc6's defence deserves to be more popular. Now you can participate in that process.